So, show of hands, who here wants to drink out of this?
$5.
No money involved. Just a normal drink of water. Yeah. Other than the guys that are trying to impress us, right? No one wants to drink out of this thing. It's failing in its only job. A cup's #1 job is to be able to drink out of. Would you guys say? What other purpose does a cup really serve? You want to drink out of it. Right now, this thing is failing because it's dirty. Outside it looks beautiful, but inside, disgusting. So, I want to compare this with later on in Matthew, chapter 23, verse 26. Jesus compares the Pharisees to a dirty cup. He says, "You are so careful to clean the outside of the cup, but inside you are filthy, full of greed and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisees, first wash the inside of the cup, then the outside will become clean as well." So we see that Jesus is not taking it lightly on the Pharisees. That's a pretty big insult. In my book, if I called you guys a bacteria-filled, smelly cup, that would not be something that you'd go home and go like, "Hey, Jordan gave me a compliment." That would be something that you would take to heart. So, to make matters worse, not only do we see that the Pharisees worried more about the outside than the inside, their main job was to teach and enforce the law of Moses to the Israelites, alright? So their job is to teach the law. But what they ended up doing was adding all of these little laws to that law that had nothing to do with much at all, except it made them feel good. They had laws such as, you could only walk so far on the Sabbath, you could only, take this much food, carry this much weight, stuff that does not matter at all. Even to the fact where they had laws about you might not be able to help someone on the Sabbath. And they called that God's law. Can you guys imagine that? That God's law saying that you cannot help someone? Does that seem like God's law to you? To me, that seems a little off base. So these are what Jesus is talking about. He says in Matthew 23, verses 3 through 4, he says to the crowds, "So practice and obey whatever they," meaning the Pharisees, "say to you, but don't follow their example, for they don't practice what they teach. They crush you with impossible religious demands and never lift a finger to help ease the burden." So this is what Jesus is talking about in our first passage, the one that we read, when Jesus says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened down." Those burdens and the weariness, he's talking about those that are trying to live up to the Pharisees' law. For 400 years after the last of the prophets, God did not speak to Israel. So between Malachi and John the Baptist, for 400 years, God was silent. So the Pharisees, in trying their best, trying to figure all this stuff out, they made a legalistic religion, meaning that it was all about the rules. How you acted was more important than who you actually were inside. So we see this a lot today. I know in my own heart, I don't know about you guys, but I'm assuming that'd be the same, is that it's easy to get into comparing games. You start comparing holiness with things as, how many times do you go to church a week? How much scripture do you read a week? How long in prayer do you spend? And we start calling that holiness, all right? Which, it's dangerous ground, because all of a sudden, that might lead us to start comparing sins. We start looking at each other and going, okay, I know I have a problem with lying, but that guy has a drug addiction. So I know God looks better on me because all I do is lie than drug use, right? I mean, God has to choose a drug use being way worse than lying, right? Wrong, all right? I know it's easy to get into that habit, but we see in Romans 6:23 that the wages of sin is death. Sin. It doesn't say what kind of sin. It doesn't say the wages of drug use is death, the wages of killing a guy, the wages of watching something that you shouldn't, all right? It talks about sin. All sin. The wages of sin is death. In Romans 3:23, we see that all have sinned and fallen short of God's glorious standard. So, right now, all of us are failing God's holy standard. Meaning that if you have a drug addiction, or if you're lying, all of us have fallen short of God's glorious standard. So we are all fallen, guys. So this idea of peace, it seems pretty attractive to me, getting back to it, because I'm thinking about, we have this legalistic environment where we're trying to earn our way to heaven, but we know we can't because, man, I can't even get through the day without struggling in some sense. How can we put it all together? How can we have this peace? This idea of peace all of a sudden becomes a lot more attractive to me. So I'm going to break down what Jesus is saying to us into 3 points for the next few minutes. The first point that I want you guys to remember is come to Christ. Now, this might sound really obvious to some of us here, but it's something that a lot of us miss. Jesus opens up the passage saying, come. He is inviting us. He is inviting those that are weary and burdened to come to Him. Now, what I want to say is that this weariness, it's this thing in our souls that we cannot fix on our own. And that idea is really unattractive to a lot of the world. This idea that we cannot fix our shortcomings is something that this world does not like. An example is, I was at a birthday party over the summer with a bunch of coworkers. And I was talking with this one guy about what I'm doing for school, going to theology class. And we started talking about how did I get involved in it. And I started saying, I felt it was God leading me. And he asked me, well, how can you know that God is leading you? Like, how do you know that God has anything to do with your life now? And the question kind of struck me, but what I said is that from where I've been, I've just felt God's presence. I know who I was, and I know who I am now, and it's not the same creature. The person I was when I was in high school is not the same that I am now, and the only explanation of that is God's work in my life. That's how I know that God has chosen me for something. And what struck me was that his response was not, oh, that's cool, or anything. It was, how do you know it wasn't just yourself? I'm like, well, I told you. I knew it wasn't me, because I know me. He's like, so it could still be you. He could not understand that there was this outside source that helped me, because he could not see it. And it was something that stuck out, because so many times in the church, we're just so used to seeing, oh, come to God, come to Christ, check, we got that. But so much of the world says that, one, God does not exist, and if He does exist, who's to say that it's not just your own strength? They don't want to admit that we cannot do it on our own. So I want you guys to know the truth here, is that God is calling you. Everyone here, God is calling you tonight. If we hear Him call, then He is calling us. That's the awesomeness of it. Jesus, He's not picking and choosing.